Middle-aged, quiet family man has a random run-in with some Russian guys with ties to the mob, which ends up putting him on a path of revenge and violent killing against the rest of that organization. Sounds very much like John Wick, doesn't it? But it's actually a new film called Nobody, starring Bob Odenkirk. Both movies are, however, written by the same person, so it's no surprise that the similarities extend beyond just the outline of the plot and make even some of the set pieces look oddly familiar. But there are differences as well. So in this film, Odenkirk plays Hutch, a family guy, wife, two children, suburban house, boring 9 to 5 office job. Every day is exactly the same, very mundane and boring, and you can see it in him, in his eyes, that he's just slowly dying every day. One night there's a burglary at his house, a home invasion, which he and his son almost stop. They have the criminals on the ropes, but Hutch lets them go at the last second, basically, and we can get a sense that he was actually holding back. He was restraining himself for some reason. He could have fucked them up, but he chose not to. But then he ends up finding another reason to wake up this more violent part of himself, which we slowly learn was always there because he had a mysterious past, and ends up basically starting a one-man war with the Russian mafia. So the key difference, I think, between this and John Wick are the character motivations. Wick was always the reluctant warrior, ended up killing all these people because he felt like this was the only thing he could do in the situation he finds himself in. He was sort of roped back into that life. Whereas Hutch is himself so bored by the family life that he just itches to tap into the violence once again. He deliberately escalates things himself at several points of the film in order to give himself the kick of the one-man war that he starts, which is an interesting element of the film. I thought this idea that he has a brutal past, but instead of being riddled with PTSD and wanting to move on from that, he's like the opposite. He's looking for a reason to go wild. It's sort of midlife crisis dressed up as a violent action film, if you will. And I was going to actually say about the characters that it's like the older version of John Wick, but then I looked up the age difference of the actors, and it turns out that Bob Odenkirk is only 2 years older than Keanu Reeves. Odenkirk is 58 years old and Keanu Reeves is 56 years old. Would you believe it? Anyway, going back to the film, I mentioned that I liked the central idea for the character. I also liked most of the action sequences, maybe save for the grand finale, which are, for the most part, well choreographed, nicely shot, properly violent. And I'm afraid of also showing the protagonist get hurt as much as the enemies. There's also a few memorable side characters, most notably Hutch's dad, played by Christopher Lloyd, very entertaining appearance by him. However, there are also a couple of problems with the movie. First off, I mean, going back to the comparison with John Wick, I know I'm using this a lot, but they really are similar movies. For me, it simply nobody the film simply didn't stand too apart from John Wick. It didn't feel like too different of a movie. I had constant deja vu from that older film. Only Wick was pretty much better in every respect. One example would be, a small thing, how we learn about who the character actually is. In this film, Hutch goes into these monologues explaining his past life to defeated enemies, which on the one hand leads to a funny joke, on the other feels very much like cheap exposition. Oh, now I'm just going to tell you my whole life story for no reason at all. And thinking back to Wick, where we learned who he was through other characters and their interactions with each other and the reactions to him, I think that was just much more elegant. Then there's the villain, which is introduced as an extremely colorful and charismatic character, almost a polar opposite to Hutch, but also someone dangerous and violent and unpredictable, basically psychopathic, a formidable foe in every way. But then the movie goes on and he ends up doing basically nothing interesting after his first scene. He's basically as useless as any of his random henchmen, which was very disappointing after all the setup that he's given. I also didn't enjoy the climax so much. I thought it was way too over the top, and it did take some shortcuts in terms of the choreography. Suddenly, it wasn't as impressive as some of the other scenes where we really see the combat prowess of the main character. The final scene in this one felt, I thought, much more generic. And also, for some reason, the film uses slow motion sequences a lot. I mean, the first 2, 3 times I was like, okay, it kind of works. But then it just happens over and over and over again to the point that I found it tedious and overused. It's a cool cinematic tool, but if you use it all the time, it becomes tiring instead of impressive. Now, having said all of that, I don't think it's a bad movie. Far from it. I think it's actually fairly decent, and its main problem is that it's so similar to another film, which was almost perfect to me. So, just a case of big shoes to fill. But if you look at it separately, it is actually fairly entertaining. Odenkirk is great as usual, the action sequences were constructed, there's humor and violence. In general, it's an okay movie. Derivative, yes, but okay. So if you like movies like John Wick and you're starved for a solid action film, because we haven't really had one for a while, I think you'll enjoy this one, even despite its flaws.